Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this NCAS webinar. The presenter this morning is Stephen Little. Stephen's a PhD student in NCAS, based in the veterinary school, although for a lot of the time he's based up country. And his background is as a veterinarian. He graduated sometime last century. Towards the latter half of last century. And he has worked for a number of years in the pig and poultry industries, including a fairly extended period of time working for one of the major feed manufacturers for animals in Australia. So he brings a lot of experience to the project that he's conducting. What he's been focusing on is trying to optimise the use of in-water medication in pig herds. And for those of you from a medical background, we like to think of this a little bit like an intravenous to oral switch. One of the problems with medicating intensively raised livestock is the most common method used tends to be in feed, and it's very hard to switch medication on and off. So water medication is a much more controllable way to deliver medications to intensively raised livestock, much better exercise in good antimicrobial stewardship. But the problem is that optimising it is a real challenge, and that's what Steve's been working on. So I'll hand over to Steve to tell you what he's been doing. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Glenn. I'll just pop up my screen. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yep, that's good.
Right, okay, yeah, good morning, everyone. I don't know how I became a pig veterinarian, but I guess someone has to do it. So here I am. So yes, I'm going to presume that perhaps you don't know a lot about pig production and the veterinary side of pig production. So I'm just going to introduce a few introductory slides, and then I'll start talking about the study, the survey that we did, which has just been published. So pig meat production, yeah, pork is the most widely used, most widely eaten meat in the world, just ahead of poultry. So it is big business. Not so much in Australia, as you can see here, but certainly globally, pig production is huge. And it's probably important to understand there's really two main types of buildings that are used to rear pigs from weaning through to slaughter weight. There's the conventional building, which involves a series of pens with floors that are perhaps either solid concrete or slatted or meshed. And then there's the eco shelter, which is more of a temporary structure that has straw-covered floors, and probably it's about 2/3 conventional, 1/3 eco shelters, certainly in Australia at least. Now, pigs suffer from a whole variety of bacterial infections as they grow and as they move from birth through the weaning phase, the grower phase, the finisher phase, as we call them. And, you know, whilst you'll see a sign like this on most front gates of a pig farm, you know, there'll be a number of these bacteria that are endemic within that herd, despite the external biosecurity measures that the farm's got in place. Now, it's really important to think about the different use patterns for antibiotics in pigs and other livestock. So we can think of really, there's 4 approaches: treatment, control, prevention, and growth promotion. Now, let's forget about growth promotion because we don't do that anymore. But this is a nice diagram because this shows the difference certainly between treatment. So this is where the pathogen, the animals are exposed to a pathogen, and you can see that if no antibiotic was applied, then this is the course of the pathology and the production losses that would occur. If we wait until the pathogen load gets to here and we've got a clinical, a blatant clinical outbreak, then that's this blue line. But if we treat, if we administer the antibiotics much earlier, because we know inevitably we will have an outbreak if we don't keep the pathogen load low, then that's what we call metaphylaxis. Okay, that's the dotted blue line, and prevention is where we have antibiotic in the feed on a continuous basis, prophylaxis. So it's important to understand the differences between treatment and control. And the advantage of metaphylaxis is that you know, we can get the same microbiological and clinical outcome with a lower dose of antibiotic, and we can also achieve reduced antimicrobial resistance selection pressure. So really the emphasis in pig production is more on metaphylaxis than it is on waiting for clinical outbreaks to occur and then treating them. And that's better from a productivity and welfare point of view as well. So there's a long list of antimicrobials that are registered for use in pigs in Australia that you can see here. And so these are contained in a set of prescribing guidelines that were published in 2018. And you can see here in the right-hand column, yeah, this is their importance in terms of human medicine. So most of the antibiotics that we're using in pig production are of low importance. I'll touch on that a little bit more shortly. So as Glenn mentioned earlier, yeah, the beauty of in-water dosing of pigs to administer antibiotics is that we've got a lot of flexibility, and so it's really well suited for control and treatment of bacterial infections. Because when you administer antibiotics in feed, it has to be manufactured at the stock feed mill. It gets put in a large silo, and so you've got effectively 2 weeks typically of medicated feed to work your way through, or perhaps unmedicated feed that's already in the silo that you have to get rid of before you can put a medicated batch of feed through the system. So obviously, if in an outbreak situation, we need to respond as rapidly as possible, and that's where water medication comes to the fore. So we've got a lot of flexibility with dosing regimens and dosing frequency. We can respond quickly. We can dose for very short periods. Typically, we would only water medicate pigs for perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 days at a time. And also because if some of the pigs are becoming clinically affected, and the first thing that will happen typically is that they will stop eating, but they will still be drinking. So we've still got a means of getting antibiotic into them. And I think this is another important one, that water medication directly involves people on the farm. It's more visible, and it just keeps people thinking about the medication program on the farm, whereas when it's put into the hands of the stock feed mill, it's perhaps easy for people just to forget it and just let things roll along. And yeah, I guess in a way we would call this an oral infusion, because when we start administering antibiotic through the drinking water, the pigs are consuming that medicated water voluntarily and continually, hour by hour. So we'd sort of liken it to an oral infusion. And there's really 2 ways in which it can be administered, which I'll talk about shortly, either through header tanks or a dosing pump. So, so the paper that I'm going to talk about, we surveyed 25 pig farm managers, and what we wanted to understand was what's the variability across farms in terms of the types of buildings that these pigs are reared in, the water supply systems, and the medication dosing systems and programs. And so there were a few criteria that we used to work out whether managers were eligible to participate, as you can see here. But I guess the big point I wanted to make here at this point was, well, why did we survey pig farm managers instead of pig vets? Wouldn't we have got better, more accurate information if we'd asked the veterinarians? And well, I think in pig production it's a bit different, because yes, the pig veterinarian prescribes the antibiotic, but to a large extent it's left to the pig farm manager to actually manage the whole process of taking that antibiotic and administering it to the pigs. And there's a number of important aspects of that are left to the pig farm manager's discretion, which I will talk about. So that's why we focused on the pig farm managers rather than the vets. So the survey had two parts. The first phase was an online questionnaire where we used RedCap to construct and manage that questionnaire. And it had 4 main parts, and it took about 40 to 45 minutes for each participant to complete. And then the second phase of the survey was a semi-structured interview, which again took about 40-45 minutes, for which I prepared an interview guide. Each interview was recorded, and the transcripts were then processed through NVivo. And so what I've got here is the final coding framework that I used. I hope you can see that all right, but you can see it's sort of broken up into 3 main parts: infrastructure, water supply and usage, and antibiotic administration. Okay, now just to give you a better feel for the participants involved in the survey and the farms, the 25 pig farm managers, we had over a 90% response rate. The vast majority of them are male and very experienced. Most of them had over 10 years in the industry, and most of them had been on the farm they were currently managing for a considerable amount of time as well. The farms were distributed around southeastern Australia. 72% of them were single site, but 28% of them were multiple site farms. So they might have had a group of sheds replicated 2, 3, 4, 5 times over a wider area. We still call that one farm. 61% were those conventional buildings I showed you. 39% were the straw-based ones. That's for weaners, and similarly for growers. You can see the number of the buildings are over 10 years of age. Another important thing here is that almost all the farms are all in, all out by room or building. So a batch of pigs comes in, batch of pigs leaves, the whole building is disinfected before the next batch comes through. Okay, so let's, I'm just now going to take you through some of the key findings from the survey. The first thing we were interested in was, well, what type of dosing equipment are people using? Most were using dosing pumps that are either, I've got a photo here, this is a water-powered pump. This is an electric pump, peristaltic pump, very similar to one you'd find in a veterinary clinic or a hospital. And very few farms were now using large header tanks in which they would mix the antibiotic and switch off their main water supply and use these as a source of water during the dosing event. There are a number of reasons why they ceased using those. Occupational health and safety, people getting up on ladders, just a feeling that they're very hard to control, and concerns about people remembering to turn the main water supply back on at the end of the dosing event. So yes, dosing pumps used. So the way these work is basically you mix up, let's say we've got a 50-litre container, we might fill it with water and then add the quantity of antibiotic and mix and dissolve that. And then the dosing pump will then just pull up that concentrated antibiotic solution, and it will inject it into the water line at a certain ratio. So in this example, it's 1 part of stock solution, as we call it, to 100 parts of water that's flowing into the building. Okay, and there's a sensor, a flow sensor attached to the pump, which regulates that. So that's the equipment that we're dealing with, and there are a number of reasons why farm managers might choose to use a water-powered pump over an electric-powered pump. One interesting finding was that preventative maintenance of dosing pumps was almost nil. Most managers' approach was, well, let's wait till it breaks before we do anything. And only one farm manager regularly calibrated their pumps. The remainder just assumed that they were accurate. So people had their preferences, and there are pros and cons with water-powered and electric-powered pumps. So the second thing we're interested in was what antibiotics are actually being administered to pigs in water, and there are several from that list I showed you earlier that these 25 farm managers were using. And as you can see from these slides, from these graphs here, this is the top two number of farms for weaners and grower finisher pigs, and the bottom two are the number of pigs, because some farms were considerably larger than the others. But as you can see, amoxicillin, so this is metaphylaxis, this is treatment. So for both metaphylaxis and treatment, amoxicillin was the most commonly used antimicrobial in weaners. And for treatment of outbreaks, amoxicillin was the most common one in growers, but lincomycin was most common in grower finishers for metaphylaxis. Okay, so as you can see, yeah, obviously amoxicillin is a beta-lactam and lincomycin is a lincosamide. So they're the antibiotics that are being used. So most of them are of low importance to human medicine, and that's consistent with previous surveys that have been done. Now, dosing calculations was the next thing we were interested in. Now, you know, obviously, well, we were pleased to find that farm managers were strictly following the veterinarian's prescription in terms of the antibiotic used, the number of pigs to be dosed, and the body weight of the pigs. The other things that were included on that prescription were the dose rate in terms of milligrams per kilogram body weight, how many daily dosing events were to be done, although sometimes that was left to the farm manager's discretion, and the meat withholding period. But one of the probably the most interesting aspect of the dosing calculations was what water wastage value was factored into the dosing calculations. So what you need to understand is that for every litre of water that flows into of medicated water that flows into the building, not all of that 1 litre will actually be consumed by pigs. They will splash and waste a proportion of that water. Now, it might be next to zero, but you know, in some instances, pigs will be wasting large proportions of the water that they're using, and that water wastage value needs to be factored into the dosing calculations, because if we want to get 20 milligrams per kilogram body weight into a pig and they're wasting 50% of the water, then we effectively have to use 40 milligrams per kilogram body weight to achieve that objective. So it was interesting to see what sort of water wastage values were being used. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later. Dosing regimens. So yeah, the number of consecutive daily dosing events. So this is for the 25 farms, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days for metaphylaxis and for treatment. And you can see that probably, yeah, the median for both was 2 days, but it was pretty arbitrary, really. You can see that many farms really, whether it was for metaphylaxis or treatment, they did it exactly the same. There are perhaps only a few farms that would dose for longer in an outbreak situation than they would for metaphylaxis. But I guess the reality is there's no evidence to help veterinarians or farm managers make that decision. There is not for other animal species as well. Now, dosing start times and how long we dose for is the other important dimension to the dosing regimen. And so what I've done here is to summarise. So this is 6 a.m. all the way to midnight, and then extending into the next day. And you can see that the majority of farms commenced dosing at about 7 a.m., which is when all the staff have started work for the day. Some might start a little bit earlier. And for some, they might only dose for 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours. But you can see that on several farms, they were dosing over 24 hours. So a lot of variation there. And you can see from these quotes that I've put in, you know, the thinking that the farm managers have. You know, some would consider that, well, if we have it in for 8 to 10 hours, every pig's going to get a hit, inverted commas, of amoxicillin. Whereas the thinking behind those who dose for 24 hours is, well, you know, we're going to give the pigs that are perhaps more subordinate, lower in the pecking order, a bit more of a chance to get to the drinker, or those that perhaps are already feeling a little sick to get to the drinker, and they felt that that was a better way to go. So a lot of variability there in terms of dosing time and duration. So now behind the thinking here in making these decisions are some assumptions about what the water usage pattern of the pigs is. And I say assumptions because of the 25 farms involved in the survey, only one of them was actually measuring hour by hour the water usage in each building. So and I haven't included it here, but you know, we did ask farm managers what they thought were the peak periods of the day, the peak water usage periods of the day, and their answers varied widely as well. So they're really making those decisions without some hard data to support them. And really, what the principle really is that we should be perhaps timing the beginning of the dosing event with a period of the day where the pig's water usage is increasing, because that's going to give us an earlier attainment of our pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic index. And so that's really, we should be timing that for a particular point in their usage pattern during the day. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more messy when we start talking about how farm managers preparing these stock solutions that I talked about earlier. And the reality is that many of these antibiotic products are actually not very soluble. And the concentrations, and here are some photos just to show you that's certainly true for products like amoxicillin. And the concentrations that we're using in stock solutions often, exceed the solubility threshold. Now, the manufacturers of these soluble antibiotic products will use solubility enhancers in the product to improve its solubility. But one of the main aids that farm managers use with amoxicillin to help it dissolve is they mix it with sodium carbonate. Sorry, we're talking about amoxicillin hydra. Yeah, so they mix it with sodium carbonate, and what they're doing is lifting the pH from the neutral sort of range to perhaps well above 8 or so to help the product in the stock solution container dissolve. Okay, so that's the big challenge with amoxicillin. There are other antibiotics that are fantastic to use and very easy to use, lincomycin, which I mentioned before, the second most commonly used one for metaphylaxis in growing pigs. And some of them have their own peculiarities. For example, tylosin is, the dust has a horrible taste. So yeah, they're all different, and some of them are easy to use and some of them aren't. So with the dosing pump, farm managers are using a wide range of volumetric injection ratios. And so they ranged from one part of stock solution to 33 parts of water, all the way through from 1 to 50, 1 to 100 to 1 to 200. So when you're using a very an injection ratio like 1 and 200, and you're only using a small volume of water in the stock solution, you're going to end up with an extremely concentrated stock solution. And this is probably the extreme example from my studies that I've observed. And in this case, the stock solution was being injected at 1 to 200, and it was 120 milligrams per mil of the product, which is really, really very concentrated, more a suspension than a solution. And these photos show that. This is not 120, this is 72 milligrams per mil. This is 51 milligrams per mil. And so you can see how some of this product has not fully dissolved, and it's taken some time for it to go into solution with continuous agitation. Usually in the bottom of the stock solution container, there'll be a little submersible pump or large magnetic stirrer just agitating and mixing. So yeah, most of the managers didn't understand the difference between a product being in solution and being in suspension. Now you might say, well, does it really matter as long as it gets through the line? But it's probably less certain that particles are going to find their way through the drinkers than dissolved antibiotic. But yeah, unfortunately for the farm managers, there really aren't any recommended protocols for preparing and using stock solutions of particular products through these dosing pumps, and it's really left to them and their veterinarians to come up with those themselves. Now, just the final aspect that we looked at was how frequently are farms using metaphylactic dosing in terms of the proportion of total rearing days during the weaner phase and the grower finisher phase. And again, we found wide variation, and there's a number of reasons for that. Certainly, the obvious one being, well, what's the level of disease within the piggery to start with that they need to control. But really, there was certainly no relationship between how often they practice that and the number of pigs on the farm, or the types of buildings, or their production flow. And the most extreme, you know, there, as you can see here, there were many farms that were not met. Probably about half of the farms were only using water medication for treatment of outbreaks, and half were using it for metaphylaxis as well. And probably the most extreme example was a farm that was perhaps medicating weaners 4 days a week and growers 2 days a week. But what I've got here is the proportion of total rearing days in the weaner phase and the grower phase. So the other thing that was good to see was that there's farms are progressively withdrawing continuous in-feed administration of antibiotics. And it was a matter of pride for a number of farms that they were no longer using any in-feed medication. And, you know, and their next objective was to see how little water medication they could use by improving their hygiene practices and biosecurity practices. So that was all good to see, but you can see the little asterisk is here to denote the farms on which in-feed medication was still used to some extent. And we finished the survey by sort of asking farm managers about what were their views on successful in-water dosing, and understandably those views were really formed largely from their experiences dealing with outbreaks, because really you know, outbreaks are the worst nightmare for a farm manager, because typically they often happen overnight, and so you know, when people get to the piggery for the next day's work, they're confronted with sick pigs, and you know, it obviously becomes you know, a situation that they have to deal with immediately and disregard all the other jobs they were going to do at the beginning of that day. So success is judged primarily on how quickly the morbidity and mortalities within a group of sick pigs were reduced after dosing commenced, but also around just how frequently outbreaks were occurring, the growth rates that they were getting from the pigs, and just how uniform pig size and body weight was during growth. And I asked farm managers in the interview to rate on a 10-point scale how satisfied they were that the majority of growing pigs in each building that were medicated had actually ingested the dose of antibiotic prescribed by the veterinarian. And I got a wide range of responses. The median score was 7.5, but it ranged from 4 to 9.5. So yeah, there's certainly many of the farm managers, you know, definitely had some reservations about some of the aspects of their dosing practices, how effective they were. Yeah, I put these two quotes in because they sort of reveal quite divergent sort of views. You know, the first one's an extreme comment that basically says a pig only has to drink a litre of water to get its full medication. So obviously that, and it doesn't matter whether it gets it in one mouthful or goes back several times. So, you know, that's one comment. But on the other hand, this farm manager sort of revealed in this comment that he really did understand at a population level some of the causes of sources of variation, and that would lead to, you know, perhaps only a proportion of pigs in a building during a dosing event actually achieving the desired systemic exposure to the antibiotic. Now, it was interesting that and in the interview I didn't prompt them at all in terms of talking about antibiotic resistance. I waited for it to be mentioned, and it wasn't mentioned by any of the participants in the conversation, but they all certainly agreed once I started talking about it that, you know, reducing antibiotic use was a worthy objective. And that's probably not surprising, because similar surveys with pig managers in other countries, Europe, the UK, Canada, have also shown that pig farm managers are sort of more concerned about just the maintaining the health of the pigs and the financial viability of the farm business, rather than, and they really see the antimicrobial resistance as an issue that their veterinarian is managing for them. So just to summarise the two main findings from the survey. One, in-water antibiotic dosing practices varied widely across the farms, as I've just mentioned. And secondly, that, you know, because there's insufficient measured data and understanding of the pharmacology and population pharmacometrics, farm managers are really unable to assess the effectiveness of their dosing events, and you know, they don't really have a rationale to help them optimize the dosing calculations and regimens and control those sources of between animal variability in systemic exposure of pigs to the antibiotics. So, you know, we would consider that successful in-water medication of pigs, you know, we're after three things: no clinical signs. We want the pathogen eliminated or numbers at least dramatically reduced, and we want to minimise selection and propagation of resistant pathogens. And we're aware of the different PK/PD indexes that apply to time-dependent and concentration-dependent antimicrobials. And as pig veterinarians, we're also conscious that really what we're trying to do is attain those target values for the appropriate PK/PD index in at least 90% of the pigs in the population, in the building that we're dosing. And so what we've found from this survey is that there's a number of suboptimal in-water antibiotic dosing practices that may have contributed to many pigs not getting sufficient exposure, and they relate to using highly concentrated stock solutions, the fact that you know, some of these antibiotic solutions have hundreds of meters to travel through the water pipes, so there is a potential for the antibiotic to be degraded if it's exposed to factors that affect its stability. There's also always the possibility of dosing pump failures or due to preventative maintenance. The use of header tanks, which thankfully most of them are being phased out. Underestimating pigs' water wastage rates is certainly a concern, and not aligning. This is, I think, an important one. Not aligning the dosing start time with the pig's water consumption pattern, because that will potentially lead to differences in the pattern of ingestion of the antibiotic over time by pigs in different locations throughout the building. And I guess the other concern is using low metaphylactic doses over 24 hours. I guess the question there as well, just what proportion of time will the pigs will systemic exposure be over the MIC at the site of infection when we're doing it over at a low concentration over a long period, as opposed to over a shorter period. And finally, just are we doing enough consecutive daily dosing events? Is 2 days enough to effectively reduce the pathogen load? So in my mind, there is potential to use front-loaded dosing regimens to achieve earlier attainment of PK/PD targets and reduce the variability and the dose of antibiotic that's ingested over time among pigs that are distributed in different pens around the building. But there's a couple of extra thoughts I've got here. Firstly, that front-loader regimens may help us increase the pathogen kill rates for particularly products like amoxicillin and beta-lactams by achieving a higher Cmax over the MIC, because it has been found that although products like amoxicillin are time dependent, the pathogen kill rates are highest when they're in the range of perhaps 2 to 4 times the MIC, and that's to do with the way that the antibiotic works in terms of binding the binding protein sites. And then finally, better suppressing the emergence of antimicrobial resistance, because what we're really trying to do is not only exceed the MIC for a certain proportion of time, but we don't want to spend any longer than necessary between the MIC and the mutant prevention concentration. So we really want to get beyond that MPC as well. So that's where possibly front-loaded dosing regimens come into play, and I'm exploring that at the moment with some other work. Now, in the paper, we put in this diagram just to sort of think about where this might, if most pigs in a group are not attaining the systemic exposure to the antibiotic that's required to eliminate the target pathogen, what might that mean? So let's assume that they do. Let's assume that everything's good. Then we'll see on a farm, we'll see planned intermittent metaphylactic dosing events. We'll see pathogen loads maintained at a low level, and that will give scope for in-feed antibiotic dosing to be ceased, and over time we would expect antibiotic use on that farm to be reduced. However, on the other hand, if we're subject to some of these practices that don't give us attainment of systemic exposure across the majority of pigs, then we're going to persist with higher pathogen loads. We're going to see disease outbreaks that need to be dealt with, and then as part of our risk management, it's likely that we'll see increased frequency of metaphylactic dosing, and we may even see the dose that's used during those metaphylactic dosing events increased from a low level to almost a treatment level in terms of milligrams per kilogram body weight, and we may well see the introduction or the increase in in-feed antibiotic dosing, and therefore antibiotic use increases over time. So yeah, they're basically the two pathways, and obviously it's the green pathway that we're seeking to follow. So this is just a summary slide to put dosing practices into a bit of context here. So we've talked about some of the aspects of dosing and how they impact on the antibiotic concentration in the water that's presented to the pigs. And we've talked about pigs actually then consuming that medicated water with a sort of a bimodal consumption pattern during the day with some wastage involved as well. And then we've got the antibiotic actually being ingested hour by hour during and after the dosing event, and finding its way to the infection site, and the end result being the clinical efficacy of the antibiotic and the extent to which we're suppressing the emergence of antimicrobial resistance. But then the other aspects to this, which I'm also investigating, are what influence does the design and management of the water supply system, the water distribution system within the pig building have on this process, and also the water demand patterns of the pigs, the water consumption patterns, how do they change and what influence do they have? So they're sort of separate investigations. So yes, in conclusion, there's considerable scope to improve in-water antibiotic dosing practices on farms and therefore increase their effectiveness. And ultimately what we're all aiming to do is reduce the use of antibiotics on farms. But that's going to need farm managers and veterinarians having access to on-farm measuring systems that allow them particularly to measure water wastage and daily water usage patterns of each group of pigs being dosed. And there's also really a great need for technical guidelines and training on in-water antibiotic dosing that's based on key principles of antibiotic pharmacology and population pharmacokinetics. So I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Helen and Glenn and Andrew, and all the Australian pig producers and veterinarians that have been involved in not just this survey, but other aspects of my work, particularly Rivoli Australia and Sunpork, which are the two largest pig production enterprises in Australia, and also obviously NHMRC, which funds the National Centre for Antimicrobial Stewardship. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm sure there's a virtual clap online, although I can't see it in the webinar format. There's a number of questions in the Q&A in the chat. I can read them out to you to save you having to read through them if you like.
Okay.
So first, Anna Shree's asked, what diseases is amoxicillin mostly used for metaphylactically?
Probably mainly enteric diseases and respiratory diseases. Yeah, it's pretty broad spectrum, really. Yep.
And Stephen Page has asked, what knowledge of water quality on farm what is the knowledge of water quality on farm generally? pH is water hardness, which is usually important for drug stability and solubility.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Stephen. There was a report done for the pork CRC from that Louise Edwards published a couple of years ago, which looked at water quality across farms, and it certainly varies widely. But I guess what I've learned is that it's probably not as much of an issue as I expected it to be in terms of its effect on the solubility of antibiotics from the lab work that I've done. It's more about these other dosing in water dosing practices are more the concern. And in fact, on the farms that I've been working with, the water quality has been, because I've obviously been testing it regularly, has been pretty good actually, regardless of whether it's bore water, dam water, or whatever the source is. So yeah, I think water quality is probably not of as great importance as I expected it to be in this respect. It's more about it's more about the dynamics of the water distribution system, and the dosing practices that we're using are more important.
Thanks, Steve. Reece Scarborough has asked two background questions. How will the recent EU regulations on prophylactic and metaphylactic, is it about metaphylactic use as well, of antibiotics in meat production affect Australian pig farming? How are they managing it in EU pig farms?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I'm not across that. You, Glenn, do you know more about that?
No, I don't know the details either. So
I'm sorry, Ree, I can't answer that one. I'll take that one on notice.
We might come back to that if we've got some time for some discussion at the end. And can you foresee any pig farm infrastructure developments, or do they already exist anywhere, that would allow farms to take individual symptomatic animals out of a herd for treatment rather than treating a whole herd? Would that be useful or possible?
I think that would be almost impossible. You know, if you think about the scale on which we're working here, you know, we've got thousands of, usually in a typical grower finisher building, there might be 2,000 or 4,000 pigs that we're medicating, mass medicating. But what we do is that the staff will go through every one of those pens in that shed, and they will individually inject any pig that they see that is struggling or is not quite clinically 100%. So they will, whilst we're water medicating, there might be perhaps 5 or 10% of pigs. This is in an outbreak situation, obviously not for metaphylaxis, but in an outbreak situation, the staff members will go through that building, and they might inject 5% of the pigs individually. The ones that they are concerned about, you know, being able to strong enough to get a drink. So in that sense, there is a individual treatment element to this that sits beside the mass medication strategy. But yeah, removing, the last thing we want to do is mix and remove pigs, because socially pigs are in groups of say 20, 50, 400, and they form their social groups. And the worst thing you can do is mix pigs at any point during their growth cycle, because that creates stress. So that would be counterproductive. We do have sick pens in most pig buildings where clinically sick pigs could be removed and are often removed, and they might be put into a sick pen for a few days just for a bit of extra TLC, but then they'll be put back into the pen that they came from. So yeah, there is an individual dimension to treating pigs, but they never leave the building that they're in.
Thanks, Steve. Kylie McIntosh has asked, recognising that environmental assessments are not common, but wondering if you're aware of any studies looking at the presence of antimicrobial residues in soil and water on farm, and also resistance in soil microbes as a result.
Yeah, I'm not aware of too many. There's been some studies, not necessarily done in pigs, but that's a really interesting aspect to all of this, because you know, some antibiotics have a very unstable outside the pig, things like amoxicillin, whereas other antimicrobials have a much more, you're going to have a longer life in effluent or manure. But no, that's not an area that I've read a lot on, I'm afraid. But there's certainly a lot of scope for some work in that area, and then that's one of our, that's obviously a implication of the amount of feces with undigested antibiotic or water, medicated water, that's finding its way into the effluent system on a pig farm or a poultry farm or whatever it may be.
And there's a related question. I think you probably covered some of this already, but thinking of the environment around the farm, do the pigs drink all the water? I think you've probably covered that. But what happens to any leftover or used to flush out the troughs? Also, when the pigs excrete the antibiotic, is the waste treated any differently?
Well, no, the waste goes through a series of settling ponds, on effluent ponds on the farm, but there's no specific process that's applied to it to remove antibiotics. One of the interesting things I might just add there, Glenn, is that, say with amoxicillin, amoxicillin's extremely sensitive to chlorine in the water, and so that's one thing to be conscious of when farms are using town water supply, that there's not a high level of chlorine in the water that inactivates the amoxicillin. I've come across that at least once.
Another question from Steve Page. Are there engineering solutions to allow more accurate, perhaps targeted dosing via water?
Yes, there are. Yeah, there certainly are. And at the moment, I'm actually using some hydraulic modelling to better understand exactly how the hydraulics of the water supply system affect the ingestion patterns of antibiotics by the pigs, and how we can improve those. But one of the interesting things about pig farms is that most of the water distribution systems within pig buildings are oversized. They've got very large pipes, and they're doing that because they want to maintain high adequate pressures throughout the building at the drinkers. But the consequence of that is that the water velocities through the system are very slow, and there are some implications for attached to that. So yeah, there are some engineering aspects of this which are part of what I've been doing recently.
And I think it just makes the point there's significant inter-pig PK/PD variation. So having variable intake adds another dimension of variation.
Yes, absolutely, it does. Yeah.
Then I'll just flick over to the chat to pick up the questions there. From Kaz Thursky, is micro routinely done before starting antibiotics for the pigs, or is the choice to start based on the clinical syndrome? And are there wrong choices based on the syndrome? Too broad, too narrow, wrong drug?
No, look, typically there'll be cultures and sensitivities done to confirm, to help make the choice about which antibiotics are appropriate. And there's a lot of abattoir inspection work that veterinarians will do for their for farms, so that they know exactly what's going on, month to month, in terms of the disease levels within the pigs, and obviously post-mortems that may be done on the farm as well. So I think that's pretty well managed.
And Kaz has followed up with what specimens are collected for that microbiology?
Well, I guess it just depends on what organs are of concern, whether that's lungs or gut sections. Yeah, it could be a variety of tissues that are collected depending on which diseases we're talking about.
Some will be necropsy specimens, I assume.
Yes, yeah. Many of them will be necropsy specimens for sure. Yeah.
And a comment from Ree Scarborough: there seems to be a lot of scope for work in all environmental AMR. I think I'd probably agree with that.
Yes. Yeah, someone needs to do it.
I don't think you were offering there. So I think we're very close to the allocated hour, and it looks like we've answered all the questions. I think there's some thanks and congratulations in the chat. Fantastic presentation. Excellent, great info. Thanks, and so on. So I'd just like to thank you, Steve, on behalf of everyone who's been here and everybody who'll will listen to the recording in the future for a great presentation. And I think we all look forward to hearing the second part of your PhD when you tell us about some of the solutions you've come up for with your look at the water systems that the farms have and how they're performing.
Yep. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.